so much, Lindsay, for this nice introduction. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here tonight at the March 8th, the International Women's Day. And of course, this day has a long history, a long tradition of struggles for women's rights and for gender equality. And today, especially in Latin America, but also in Southern Europe, women's groups transformed this tradition into a sort of what they call women's strike, especially to point to violence against women and the necessity to take measures against femicides and against intimate partner violence. So, as Lindsay already said, and some of you discussed today, violence against women is indeed a burning issue for gender equality and for women's emancipation. However, I would like to give you insights into another aspect of gender equality policies. And I want to talk tonight about women's representation in parliaments, that is, in those institutions which make the laws that might improve the situation of women towards more equality. Although there is no direct or automatic relation between the number of women in decision-making bodies and then to more women-friendly politics, how we might label it. But nevertheless, existing research shows that the visibility of women in politics is crucial for the improvement of the situation of women in society. But the role of women in politics in Europe seems to be what I would call a never-ending and disappointing story of underrepresentation. The political sphere is not very open for change and for the inclusion of women into political institutions. To the contrary, political institutions resist gender equality. Nevertheless, the development of women's quantitative representation in parliaments shows progress, but of course with huge differences between countries. In 2020, Sweden was the only European country in the world top 10 countries of quantitative representation of women in parliament, with 47% women in the Swedish Riksdag. But this has been, however, a very barely growth since 1995. So in 25 years, the number of women in the Swedish parliament increased only by 7%. So this is rather low, the increase. In 2020, Rwanda led the worldwide top 10 list of women's representation in parliament with 61% women in its National Assembly. And Cuba was the country with the second highest number of women in parliament. Of course, we might doubt that these countries are democracies, but the numbers, the overall numbers show that liberal democracies are not optimally positioned in terms of female representation in a global comparison. The number of women in the Dutch second chamber stagnates since years at 33%. The German Bundestag has only 31%, while the Austrian Nationalrat is doing better with 39%. Britain's lower house has only a percentage of 20% women. And overall, in the European Union, the situation is worse in Hungary, with only 15% women in the parliament. France, on the other hand, is the country with the highest increase since 1995, from 6% women in 1995, which is really very poor, to 39% in 2020. And this is due to the French parity law, meaning to strict regulation of quotation. So, and tonight I'll talk about women's quotas in parliament and how we can explain in the first sec the representation of women at all in parliament, but also on the other hand, how to explain stagnation and low numbers of women still. So the most efficient factor for the evolution of women in electoral politics are gender quotas. The French example shows this. The adoption of quotas started in European countries already in the 1990s, where some parties adopted what is called voluntary party quota. So some parties decided to introduce gender quotas. This was the case, for instance, in Austria and Germany, but also in the UK. And after that, quite a few countries introduced legislative, that means binding quotas for all parties. This is, for instance, France, as I already said, with a parity law, but also Belgium, Ireland, and Spain. And especially the former state socialist countries, they were under pressure during the accession negotiations to the European Union, so they had to perform very gender-friendly, and these countries also introduced legislative quota, for instance, Poland or Slovenia, also Croatia. Some countries in Europe do not have gender quota. Of course, some do not have, but interestingly, Denmark and Finland do not have gender quota, but they have one of the highest percentages of women in parliament, and I come to that later. So against this background of a successful adoption of quota regulations, the resistance of the political realm towards equal representation of women needs specific explanation. And just to give you one explanatory example, for Germany and Austria, experts showed that there exists something that can be labeled a post-quota gender gap. So the major parties, they have quotas, but they don't implement them, and they are not able to transfer their quota stipulation into a respective number of women in parliament. And this was the case for Austria until the elections in 2017, and until then only the Green Party in Austria was able to confirm its 50% quota in the Austrian Nationalrat. Neither the Social Democrat, the SPÖ, nor the ÖVP was able to transform their 40% gender quota into seats in the Nationalrat. They were always below their quota with around 30%. I'll explain this later, but this example shows that something happens against gender quota in the process of their implementation. And this is nearly the case in all the European countries. We have these wonderful quota regulations, but when it comes down to earth, when they are implemented in the political process, they somehow vanish and disappear, or are not successfully implemented. So the aim of my talk tonight is to somehow shed light on this, what is called secret garden of quota politics, and to make the secret garden more transparent. And I would like to offer insights into processes of quota implementation and how these quota implementation processes are undermined or blocked through different institutional but also individual settings. Of course, it's an easy guess to say, well, these are all party democracies, then it's the parties that torpedo successful quota implementation. And of course, this is true, and I'll come to this in a minute. But before, I just want to point out two other important factors that impede a successful implementation of quota regulation. And the first factor are labeled cultural factors, mainly referring to a gender unequal culture, or we could also say referring to a masculinist culture in society that transfers into resistance to gender equality in politics. And second, there are institutional factors which were for me at the beginning very hard to understand, and these institutional factors refer to electoral systems, for instance, but if you take a closer look, it's very easy how parties, again, play with these electoral system rules. And of course, I did the studies to understand what is going on in this flawed quota implementation, and then also being able to suggest counter mechanisms to quota resistance. So the first factor, cultural blockages. Those are found on a societal level where gendered structure creates unequal gender cultures and gender regimes. So usually in science we differentiate between conservative gender regimes and more equality-oriented gender regimes. So conservative gender regimes correspond with a hierarchical gender order, a gender division of labor, and a strict division between what is public, political, and on the other hand, private family. And to these divisions, or these divisions correspond with dominant gender images, mainly visible dominant masculinity on the one hand, and on the other hand, subjected and invisibilized femininity. And these hierarchical gender regimes influence attitudes of citizens as well as attitudes of politicians. And these conservative gender regimes, they translate into skeptical attitudes towards gender equality in general, but also towards gender equality, particularly in politics. Austria, Germany, and Switzerland are typical countries in Europe with such a more conservative gender regime, and this translates into gender divisions of labor also in politics, and to very stereotypical gender images of men and women in politics. So these countries of the conservative gender regime, they often legitimize the rejection of gender equality in politics by discrediting women as quota women, who are presented as being less qualified than men for politics. Party actors pick up these quota stigma and reinforce these anti-gender resentments, saying that the best candidate should win, and this is, of course, a man. The anti-gender or the anti-equality mood is also amplified in these countries by the media. So media usually do not work against these stereotypical gender images, but they reproduce these gender images and they then foster anti-quota resentments in the countries. Usually these media, and we did a study for Germany, these media either report less on women politicians, they just ignore them, or they present women politicians as incompetent, as we just heard about Pamela Rendi-Wagner. So differently from these conservative gender regimes are more egalitarian regimes, and this egalitarian culture, gender culture, forms the background also of egalitarian attitudes in society, which is then transformed to more gender equality in politics and to a more gender equal atmosphere in parties. So there exists an equality norm in these countries, and this equality norm facilitates the implementation of gender equality in politics and then the implementation of gender quota, for instance. But some of these gender equal regimes, just like Denmark, as I said, or even Sweden, they do not need quotas at all, because parties are pressed by public attitudes to position women on their electoral lists. And the citizens, the electorate, would never accept electoral lists where women are positioned only very low, on very low ranks, or where all male lists exist. So that's why parties are pressured by public opinion to promote women to take over positions in politics. And parties in these countries, they really invest in women candidates even without quota regulation. So what we can learn from this first factor is that gender regimes need to be changed towards more equality in order to achieve gender equality in politics. But as I already said, there exists a second factor which is important for successful or unsuccessful implementation of gender equality, and this is the institutional setting of electoral systems. And let me briefly explain this. I hope it's not too technical. I think it's rather easy to understand. So in political science, we distinguish between two electoral systems: the majority system, which exists in UK or in the US, or the proportional voting system, which is the case in Austria, but also there are mixed electoral systems, which is the case, for instance, in Austria. So in majority voting systems, the winner takes it all. So we have an electoral district, and for those of you who come from the UK and are familiar with this system, you cast your vote and only the person on top of the list, only one person per electoral district, is then elected to the parliament. And most of the time, of course, this winner the person on top of the list is a man and not a woman. And interestingly, this is an explanation for the very poor percentage of women in the lower house in UK, because what the parties do, and all parties do that in the UK, is they strategically select the electoral districts, and they know, oh well, we will win in this district, so we position a man there on top of the list. Well, we will anyway lose the other district, so we can position a woman on top of the list. She'll never make it into parliament. So, and this is really a strategic positioning of men and women on lists, and so in this majority voting system, it's mainly men who are the winners. Only the Labour Party established what they call all-women shortlists. So they had a quota regulation which said, well, shortlisted, meaning on top of electoral lists, need to be all women, so that women have chances to get elected into the parliament, so that women are empowered to win an electoral district. So this is different from the proportional electoral system, and usually proportional electoral systems are much more women-friendly, because in one electoral district not only one person makes it into parliament, but several persons make it into parliament. According to the votes the party attained during the election. So, and under these several candidates to parliament are usually women, and if the parties are obliged to have not all male lists, but have to have only also women on lists, then it's rather or it's possible that women also make it into parliament. And this is especially true if we have quota regulations for list composition which has zippered lists, so the zipper system saying man, women, man, women, man, women. Then, of course, if you have a pool of 10 people that make it into the parliament, you have 50% women usually. But as I said, for Austria, Austrian parties failed to do so. You see, either they do not apply the zipper list, or they start their zipper list with a man. And for Austria, this is a rather sad story, and this is why parties fail to have to reach their quota stipulation. The Austrian electoral districts are so small that often only one person makes it from the district into the Nationalrat. So this small size of the Austrian electoral districts has the same effect as in the majority system. Yeah? So there has been a lot of debate to change the electoral districts, to make them bigger, so that more people make it into the Nationalrat. But this failed, of course, because Austrian parties have to decide on this in the Nationalrat, and they know, oh well, if we would decide in this direction to change the electoral districts, then maybe our male incumbents would lose and would not make it into the parliament. So even in a proportional system, you see the mismatch between the electoral system and party quota do exist, so that women do not make it into parliament. And this is also the case for the mixed electoral system in Germany, where you have a majority element and where you have the proportional element. And there you can see half of the seats in the German Bundestag come from this majority element, all male, and the other half of the Bundestag comes from the more proportional system vote, and there women have a chance to make it into the Bundestag, but still the numbers are very low there. So, and as I said, for the Austrian case, only the Greens were able to secure their 50% quota stipulation in the Nationalrat, while the SPÖ and the ÖVP failed to do so. Recently, the Neos, they do not have a quota stipulation at all, but they usually have around 50% female representatives. The Freedom Party rejects any quota in the elections, and as far as I remember rightly, there the percentage is around 17% women in the FPÖ club. So these are the two major factors, or not the major factors, the last and major factors are inner party struggles and inner party constellations, and I will go into these inner party issues now. And as I already said, very often we see that instead that party play by the rules in creating and composing electoral lists, they play with the rules. They somehow try to circumvent their quota regulation. And what is interesting, most of the parties in Europe did not revise the procedures and the processes to compose their electoral lists according to their quota regulations. So they have the quota regulations, either voluntary, they promise to do so, or they are obliged by the law to implement the quota, but they just do not have regulations how to compose their electoral list. So this is mainly done by chance, and it's mainly the duty of the women's branches of the parties. They have to look for women willing to run on electoral lists, so it's really more informal and unofficial recruitment systems, and therefore this is not rather effective. And also it's there are no mechanisms within the parties that sanction if parties do not comply with their quota regulations. So there are no sanction mechanisms, and there is also no mechanism to publicly, for instance, shame and blame parties if they do not comply with their quota regulations. Of course, there are counter movements. When and the French case is interesting, when the French parity law was enacted, parties had to pay a fine if they do not comply with the 50% gender quota. And at that time, then, well, the party said, we just pay the fine. It's not that much, so we pay the fine, and then that's it. This changed, and that's why then in France, so the increase of female representative was so high. And other countries in Europe followed then the French example. In Ireland, for instance, also compliance with gender quota, with legal gender quotas, is combined with party funding. or with fines on the other hand. So we have both, either parties have to pay if they do not comply, or they receive more state funding if they comply with their party rules. We also have in place in some countries, but only in some countries, for instance in Poland, that regulations that party lists, electoral lists, are rejected if they do not comply with the quota regulation. So the party then wouldn't be able to run for elections. And I think this is the most efficient mechanism to ensure that quotas are enacted in the electoral process. However, Poland is also an example which shows that even if you have sanction mechanisms, but as the Polish country does not have a zipper system, it's not worth anything, because Polish parties then apply the quota system on electoral lists, but positions women on the bottom of part of electoral lists, so, and then women do not make it into the Polish parliament the same. So you see, there is still progress needed, and what we can learn is that the architecture of the quota implementation needs to be improved, and that there need to be sanctions that parties really comply to the quota regulations. So there are 3 other factors that block the party quota implementation, and one factor refers to these conservative gender images, which are also dominant in a lot of parties. And these stereotypical images still see men as the ideal politicians. Women are only seen as men's stand-ins, as not that powerful, as not that well equipped for politics. And these stereotypical images we do not find them in the gender equal countries, but in the conservative countries they are very predominant. And especially what we found in our study, we studied 17 European countries, especially in former state socialist countries, these very stereotypical images are still present. We made interviews, and the team in Slovenia found one very weird example, saying, well, women, if they want to be in politics, they have, and I quote, they have to have a pleasant appearance. Otherwise, they will not be accepted in politics. So, and I think this is a good example how stereotypical still party culture works in Europe. And of course, this stereotypical idea that the winning politician is a man is especially true for majoritarian electoral systems, as in the UK, but we also find it in Germany, and I think we also see it in Austria. Only, as I already said, in countries with a more equality norm, such as Denmark and Sweden, we see that women in politics are seen as normal and are accepted. However, what we also found in our study, if women make it into politics, if they have a position within parties, they contribute to a more gender equal culture, because they can act as role models, so they attract younger women, and this overall contributes to a more gender equal positioning. Also the presence of women, of active women, but also of women's caucuses is important for the implementation of party quotas within parties. So, of course, this is depending then on the strategic and organizational power of these women in parliaments, but the German Christian Conservative Party has the experience that the women caucus within this party has always been rather loud and complaining that they do not have a chance to get positions within the party. And now you can say, well, but the party had a leader for a long time, Angela Merkel, and she was not that engaged in introducing party quotas in the CDU, but nevertheless, so the Women's Caucus used this opportunity of saying, well, we have a female leadership, we also want to have a voice, and then the party finally agreed to introduce they did not call it quota system, but a quorum system, so of 30% women, so that now women can advance other women within the party. So, secondly, what is important for the implementation of quota is party ideology. And what we find across Europe is that more left-wing or center-left parties are more gender equally oriented. And this gender equal norm then translates into a better implementation of party quota, but I'm rather hesitant. I say a better, not really a successful implementation, as I showed with the example of the Austrian SPÖ. Contrary to these more equal atmospheres, we still have the conservative parties or right-wing parties that with their conservative party ideology are more hesitant to implement gender quotas if they have such a quota system at all. So here we can learn that the party women section is important, that it needs a public voice, and that these party women are the main actors in transforming stereotypical gender images towards more gender equality. And because it's also in the interest of these party women, because they want to have positions in politics and not only be in the second or third rank. So, and the final inner party factor is sort of active resistance against a quota. And here we have rather different forms of active resistance. One active resistance is discrediting quota systems at all, saying, well, they are anti-democratic, they disturb liberal processes of democratic elections, they disturb the choice of the voter, because the voter doesn't want to have a zippered electoral list. The voter wants to elect the candidates he or she thinks are most qualified for politics. So this is one major argument, and you can see that the Austrian electoral system with preference vote very often works with this argument, saying, well, we have to have separate lists of the major parties, but if you want to vote for the man, just give him your preferential vote, so you can push him on top of the list and just change the order of a zippered list. So this is very strategic, often very strategic struggle for so that women, that men who are not on top of the list may be pushed on top of the list. And then what we also see as active resistance towards quota is an argument which we hear rather often in Austria or in Germany, saying, well, women just do not want to run for office. Women are not interested in politics. We do not find women who will run for the next election. Interestingly, as I said before, in more equality-oriented countries such as Sweden or Denmark, parties care about women, and they do not have problems to find women which run for office. What we also found as active resistance in some countries is that if women have been elected, there are motions of non-confidence against these women representatives. They are somehow forced to step down and make the way free for male candidates. We found this in Belgium as well as in France. And here we come back, let's say, to the issue of sexual violence in parliament and in political parties. This is a topic which hasn't been explored that much in the past, but now research starts, and we already know that this exists. So there is harassment, there is sexual violence against women, just to prohibit that women are empowered. So this form of harassment and sexual violence is a means to actively disempower women in politics. So what we can learn from this, we somehow have to change party personnel. So, but to conclude, we found in our study that quota implementation processes are characterized by resisting institutions, meaning institutional settings, but also party actors, which resist successful quota implementation. However, in many cases, we also encounter equality actors who resist these resisting institutions. And we found ways to subvert or alter these blockages against quota implementation. So mainly, and these are mainly women political actors, they upend quota-resisting institutional settings and insist on putting existing rules and regulations into praxis. And sometimes we found also innovative modes of quota implementation. They, for instance, as I said with the German CDU, publicly scandalize half-hearted quota implementation and publicly demand stringent accountability. And what these party women also do, they form coalitions with civil society organizations and with the media to push parties towards putting the policies they formally commit to, gender equality policies, to put these policies into practice. They use blaming and shaming tactics in order to trigger a contagion effect in non-quota complying parties. And of course, this contagion effect we found is also important because politics is about competition over power, and we also found in our studies that this party competition triggers a sort of contagion effect. Always when parties think that is in favor of their success at the ballot, they copy gender quota sensitive party strategies, and they improve their quota performance. This was the case, I don't know if you remember, what Sebastian Kurz did in the 2017 elections. He wanted of course he wanted to get rid of the older ÖVP stuff. That's why he tried to promote women, but he also moved more to the right, to the Freedom Party, and at the same time he was strategically aware that this move to the right needs to somehow be compensated, and that's why this, what we call contagion effect, took place. So he copied the Green Party and the SPÖ, and sometimes in some districts the ÖVP had 50% quota on its electoral lists. So there is still hope that gender equality in politics will improve over the next years, and this change process within parties might be a sign for the democratization of liberal democracies. It might also be an instrument for further democratization. Thanks.